As you know, it's been a sad week at ABC News, especially here at This Week. David Brinkley was the original anchor of this broadcast from 1981 to 1996, and he set the standard by which we will always measure ourselves. In the city of power, there were few among the powerful who did not sit down for an interview with David Brinkley. We brought some of them together today to share their thoughts and memories.
From ABC News. This Week with David Brinkley. Now from Washington, David Brinkley.
Mr. Speaker, thanks for coming.
David, good to be here.
Pleased to have you.
If you were my age, you started out feeling intimidated because this was one of the great giants of broadcast journalism, and you'd grown up with David Brinkley. So the first couple of times it was kind of like, wow, I couldn't quite believe I was on the same set.
Senator Dole, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you. When I was on David Brinkley's show, I felt like I'd really arrived. I finally made it to the big time.
I always felt that if they had a Nobel Prize for television reporting, David Brinkley would have won it time in and time out. He had a preciseness, a measurement, an understanding of news, and a reassuring quality that brought great trust.
Mr. Mfumi, how long, I assume you want affirmative action to continue for some time. How long?
When I got a chance to actually find myself on a set with him, getting ready to be interviewed, I guess he kind of sensed that I was a little tight, and he came over and slapped me on the back and said, "Don't worry, the season can't be that bad." And I thought he was talking about the Orioles season, and I immediately kind of loosened up.
His questions were good. You could tell, at least I could tell when he was asking a question and I was answering, that he was listening, that he was a good listener, and you could see it in his eyes. You could also see in his eyes that he was interested and intrigued in what he was going to ask next as he started to ask a question, and that he'd thought things through. But when you were talking to him, he was listening, and that's a wonderful quality.
Mr. Jackson, thanks for coming. Good to be pleased to have you with us.
He was congenial. He would smile, but he was fundamentally a serious person who never stopped thinking, never stopped searching. Most of all, he remained believable. He never traded away his credibility for the quick fix.
Mayor Giuliani of New York City, thank you for coming.
I can remember the first time I was on remote so that you could hear the conversation that was going on, during the interruption. And he was very, very funny. I mean, he had the same wit and sense of humor off the camera as he did when he was on camera. So that's always a nice thing to see, that somebody is the same, that it isn't, it isn't like two different personalities. And he had a way of putting you at ease. I mean, he had a way of putting you at ease and sometimes, therefore, getting more out of you. If someone is a very confrontational interviewer, you're kind of guarded and ready and prepared and careful. But if somebody puts you at ease, sometimes you'll give away more than you actually want to. And I think he had a capacity to do that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for coming in. Pleased to have you with us.
The first impression we got is you were involved in a laid-back, quiet conversation. And then you quickly realized that he was getting to the core of issues, and you found yourself starting to say things you hadn't really intended to say. And indeed, there were occasions when I must admit I made some inadvertent news as a consequence. And there's no question, the economy is beginning to tighten. The news that appeared in the day subsequently to that, which apparently moved markets far more than I had intended, encouraged me not to appear on a Sunday show again. And to this day, David Brinkley show is the last Sunday show I've appeared on until today, in memory of David.
No matter who he was talking to or who he was talking about, he always treated that individual with respect. Sometimes we don't see that as often as we would like to in contemporary American television.
As far as anyone here can remember, the black vote has been automatically Democratic. Is it no longer true?
He was not without an opinion, but one had a sense that it was a fair and thorough and thought through. And much of today's journalism is so hot. It's so ratings-driven. It's so propaganda-driven. Sometimes the trade-off for the hot breaking news is to miss the depth and authenticity. And Brinkley represented depth and authenticity.
It's a remarkable intelligence that you were dealing with. It's interesting. He essentially let the facts drive his opinions. And as a consequence, you had the general view that he was apolitical. And I got to know David pretty well over the years, and I will tell you, to this day, I don't know whether he was a liberal or a conservative.
David Brinkley always believed in the basics of reporting and the basics of journalism. He had to get it right. He had to make sure it was balanced, and he delivered it without giving a sense of where he stood on a particular issue. But when he delivered it, you stopped and you listened because you knew this was somebody that actually knew what they were talking about. That's one thing that I think may be missing somewhat today, but it is a real challenge to journalists, particularly younger journalists who, unlike him, they do have a script now. They do have a model. And if they follow it, the David Brinkley model, they'll never go wrong.
I hope that his legacy is that younger journalists will be able to recognize how professional he was, how extensive his research, and how interested he was in his profession.
At the most impressionable times of my life, the 60 convention and the 64 convention, 68 convention, the presence of David Brinkley at those very key events, as well as later on, but those were the times in terms of the century that were enormously moving and momentous times, and he was at the center. And I always remember how people regarded, I know that was true about President Kennedy and our brother Robert Kennedy as well, had the great respect that they had for him as a news broadcaster, and the admiration that they had for him as a complete professional.
You think they've seen their day, David?
Yeah, I think if David Brinkley's coverage of conventions, the way I do Bob Hope's emceeing the Oscars.
He taught me, but I must say I never learned to speak in short sentences.
David was a very impressive man, but he never took himself very seriously, and that's a wonderful quality to have around this town.
To be interviewed by David Brinkley was to sort of be questioned by your teacher in the 4th or 5th grade. You always had a feeling that the person that was asking you the question knew a good deal more about the subject that you were commenting on, and that you were supposed to know something about it.
Senator Moynihan and Senator Dole, you've both been up half the night. You must be tired out. You've got to go back later today. Is this a good way to run the country's business?
And he didn't try to, twist you a little bit or put a spin on the story. He laid it out there.
It was a rare quality, a rare talent, and he is greatly missed.
In honor of David, we have a special roundtable today. It's my pleasure to welcome back Sam Donaldson, Cokie Roberts, and George Will. The original Brinkley Roundtable. Welcome back to all of you. Thank you. And we just heard from all of the politicians, the policymakers, their tributes to David. Sam, I just want to start out with what you think were David's distinctive contributions as a journalist.
Well, before David, people who read the news, this is the news. My name is H. Allen, whatever my distinguished name is. David came along. Well, I'm David Brinkley. Number one. Number two, we've heard about his writing. I think only he and the man who actually wrote the Gettysburg Address could have done that. Short sentences, short words. But let's face it, with the substance that he brought, it was that distinctive voice. And just lifted him up. Well, you couldn't help but be around him. He wiped out a whole generation of NBC correspondents who, without meaning to, found themselves patterning their voice after his.
Yes, as Fred Allen once said, imitation is the sincerest form of television, and he had a lot of imitators on television. He came here, George, in 1943 when Washington was, as he later wrote, a town of magnolias and mosquitoes. He stood around the desk of the first president he covered, Franklin Roosevelt, for these press conferences. Roosevelt in leg braces, Roosevelt in a wheelchair, and the press never covered that. The 11th president he covered, Mr. Clinton, the press covered everything. And that's a difference in Washington, and David saw it all. And I think what made him so special to me was he understood in the news business how important it is to know that there's less new in the news than you think. He'd seen a lot of it in 40 years, and he didn't get excited.
And Cokie, you know, Sam talked...
There were times when he did show some passion, particularly earlier on. Newt Gingrich just said in that lovely tribute that growing up with David Brinkley, it was remarkable to be on the set with him. And I of course, had exactly the same feeling when I came to work there. This was a man I had seen every night growing up. But it was particularly true that I had seen him every night, many of those nights in the South, and as part of a Southern family. And he, from Wilmington, North Carolina, talking about the civil rights movement and about civil rights, was a very important voice in those years. I remember friends and relatives always saying, well, they're a bunch of Yankees, they're a bunch of outsiders, they don't know us, they don't understand how we live. Nobody could say that about David Brinkley, and it made a big difference.
He'd love to tell the story, if I may, about how in those days, a station in North Carolina hired someone to counter Brinkley's lies on Huntley Brinkley. That man's name? Jesse Helms, who went to the Senate.
You know, we also heard from Jesse Jackson saying that Brinkley was not without opinions, and Alan Greenspan says you could never tell if he was a liberal or a conservative. But how would you describe David Brinkley's politics?
Well, he was a man of strong opinions off camera, but the true professional that he was, he kept them out of his work. I defy people who watched him on Sundays to really tell you, as he questioned the people, whether he was a liberal or conservative. I think early on, probably, he was a liberal about civil rights. I think he thought President Kennedy did basically a pretty good job. I think later in life, like most of us, he sort of drifted a little toward the right, to George's side.
Are you drifting, Sam?
Not yet, son.
He was a Southerner. He was, as Cokie was saying, he was a different kind of Southerner, an upper South Southerner with some liberal, progressive strains in him, but culturally he was deeply conservative.
And Cokie hated taxes.
I think it's fair to say he was not pro-taxes. I think that
he'd been audited.
He had a good many homilies on that subject, and I think it's fair to say he was not pro-Castro, another person who was often the butt of David's sermons.
David came to ABC and started this program back in 1981 after 38 years at NBC News. And when he came to Sunday Morning with all of you, you guys really created something new. The Roundtable was brand new in 1981. It hadn't really been seen on television before. And George, I wonder if you can just describe how David saw this, what he tried to do with that every Sunday, how he tried to conduct it.
Well, two giants of television got together. It was Roone Arledge, saw that David was a free agent and signed him up. And what Roone Arledge really wanted was the Roundtable. He saw a program that was on in Washington called Agronsky and Company. Martin Agronsky used to run it. And he said, let's do that. And
you were on that.
I was on that. And he sort of stacked the interview portion on top of it to make an hour program. And David had been present at the creation of the evening news show. He'd been a correspondent for John Cameron Swayze on the Camel News Caravan. One of the requirements of which was that the anchor, Mr. Swayze, have a lit camel in view at all times during the television broadcast. So David was there. He oversaw. Cronkite went first, but they all moved at about the same time, from 15 minutes to half an hour. And then David came and said, we can do an hour of this. There's an audience out there for an hour of sobriety on Sunday morning.
But here's what he brought to the Roundtable. You know, if you have some tigers and lions, you have to have a very strong ring master. And he can either do it with a whip to keep them from tearing each other apart, or as David did it, with sort of a velvet glove. When George and I, or Cokie and anyone would go at it on an issue, and I would tell the world how George was absolutely wrong to want to cut taxes to zero, and David had had enough of it, he would simply say, Sam, and raise his hand. And believe me, I shut up.
And Cokie always seemed to have a...
It was the daddy. He was the daddy, and Sam was the bad boy, and George was a little smart aleck, and David did keep that going in just the right fashion.
Right of reply, George?
No, that's exactly right. He was adult supervision.
I feel like David Brinkley here. I can't get a word in edgewise. I'll just put my hand out there, Sam. But he always had seemed to have this very bemused look on his face as you all were going at it. It was fun to watch. Let's talk a little bit about David Brinkley, the person. You all worked with him for a very, very long time. We heard Rudy Giuliani say, Sam, that he was the same way off camera as he was on.
He was an elegant gentleman. I never heard David Brinkley with an outburst off camera. He was a little shy, believe it or not. I mean, he could talk to people, of course. Oh, no, yes. David did not. I mean, some people that I know are flamboyant, but David just enjoyed people, and that infectious laugh was what distinguished him.
After Lowell Thomas, go ahead, Cookie.
He was incredibly kind, and he was wonderfully kind to me. He was very kind to the young people who worked with us, always made a point of going out with them, meeting their parents, doing those kinds of things. When people would come up to him in airports, and keep in mind, he was the most famous man in America. He couldn't have been sweeter to them, even though, as Sam says, he was shy about it. But his kindness always shone through, and his incredible professionalism. I remember once in the Persian Gulf War, the news changed during the program. Teleprompter copy came up at the end of the show that he had never seen before, and he corrected it live on the air for content and for grammar.
Lowell Thomas and Edward R. Murrow were, I guess, the first broadcast superstars on radio. He was the first television journalist celebrity, and it interfered with what he was trying to do. He said it got to a point where he could not go out, as you did really now with John Kerry. He would go out and he would draw more attention than the candidate. So he was drawn back, and again, I think you're right, Sam, a sort of native shyness took over. And that shyness was accommodated by this courtliness, this extreme politeness. Told a story. He's entering Frank Sinatra's house, 2 very valuable matched vases on either side of the entrance. A guest knocks one over, breaks it. The guest is mortified. Sinatra said, I always hated those vases, and knocked the other one over. And Brinkley thought that as a gesture of courtesy was wonderful, and that summed up David.
And that is the last word. George, Will, Sam Donaldson, Cokie Roberts, thanks very much for coming back. And we'll be back with some final thoughts.
Happy Father's Day.
Good night, David.
Finally, the day after tomorrow is Valentine's Day, our annual celebration of love for one another, usually expressed with cute little cards from Hallmark, flowers, Whitman's samplers. But an altogether different kind of Valentine appeared in Jackson, Georgia. A woman named Mary Pop wanted to express her affection for a man named Carl Isaacs. The inconvenient fact was that Isaacs was in jail, charged with murder. But as they say, love will find a way. So Mary Pop sent Isaacs a box of cookies with a 12-inch hacksaw inside. But the police found it, and now they're both in jail in separate cells.
It's humbling to sit in David Brinkley's chair because as a broadcaster, he did so many things so well. And he always gave you a reason to stick around to the end of the broadcast. This morning, we've already showed you some of David's one-of-a-kind show closers. Now his final homily from This Week with David Brinkley.
Years ago, young newspaper and radio reporters like me looked at the first flickering bluish pictures on the brand new tiny television screens. One of them actually was round like a porthole, and wondered if we would ever learn to work with them. Well, some did learn. Some famous radio names, Kaltenborn and many others, could not learn, and disappeared from the air. Grand and glorious American ingenuity, having given the world the electric light, the airplane, the movies, and more, gave another, television. People accustomed to hearing each other could now see each other. And they could also see the ball games and movies new and old, pictures from the moon and Mars, political conventions, news from abroad, among much else, Winston Churchill's funeral and Princess Diana's. Commonplace now, then it was new and exciting. For me, working in television since it began, it has been a wonderful time. First working with Chet Huntley, and later here with Sam, Cokie, George, and Roone Arledge, the boss and the best. With the support of my wife and our children, with viewers over 40 years writing me thousands of very kind notes, with ABC News paying me to do what I would like to do anyway, and asking only that I do it well and do it honestly. On this, my last word here on ABC, I quote Shakespeare, who said, "All's well that ends well." My time here now ends extremely well. Thank you.